I'm very happy to be introducing this. Well, as I said, this is the 8th conference, the 8th Austrian conference. We take this seriously, we believe in tradition, in the good sense. And well, I hope this will start a tradition. I don't know if I have, thank you. I hope this will start a tradition. It's a great starting point, which is the Juan Carlos Cachanosky Memorial Lecture. Some of you, the ones who are from Latin America, I'm sure, well, I know most of you knew him. Let me tell you just a little bit about who Juan Carlos was and why he was so important for us and why we are doing this. I said that we consider Rosario like a second Vienna, or something related to Vienna, because of Austrian economics, and in part, in a big part. That's why, by the way, this was Juan Carlos. In part, it was thanks to him. Why? Because in the early 90s, he was asked by the Catholic University in Rosario, my city, to basically create from scratch the economics department. And he put basically there all Austrians, and I think for a matter of quotas, 1 or 2 from Chicago. You need to have some deviation. But most of these guys are still teaching today. Most of them are part of either the academic or the honorary committee of our conference. They have been giving speeches in all our conferences. Some of them could have been here, but unfortunately the economic crisis that we have in Argentina today, it didn't allow it. And that is, and that Juan Carlos was asked to create an economic department for a Catholic school. That's a miracle in itself and puts him probably in the path for canonization. And that was a feature of his life. Every life he touched, every place where he was in contact, he made it better. Let me tell you a story. This is Hans Sendholz. He was the first gentleman to get his PhD under Ludwig von Mises. Juan Carlos met Sendholz, I think, in 1980. This is told in an interview that Adrián Rabier, who will be speaking today, he's from Argentina, made with Juan Carlos and published with Unión Editorial. He met, I think, in 1980 with Sendholz and wanted Sendholz to become his PhD director, advisor. Sendholz at the beginning was quite hesitant and skeptic. But when Juan Carlos told the topic that he was planning to write his dissertation, he immediately, accepted. Juan Carlos wanted to write about the use of mathematics in economics. He was, very, very against it. And finally, when Juan Carlos took the defense of the dissertation, Sendholz told him, when he finished, he told him that Mises himself had asked Sendholz to write about this issue, and he never did it. And with this dissertation, he felt that he was paying, a debt to his old master. So that was the things. And by the way, thanks to the efforts of Adrián and Nicolás Cachanosky, one of the sons of Juan Carlos, this thesis has been just put online. It's online at journallibertas.com. You can download it, and there are 2 very nice introductory notes by Peter Bethke and Gabriel Zanotti, who is a great Austrian from Argentina. Juan Carlos had several interests, from value-based management to the explanations on. He has written a lot about explanations of the 1929 financial crisis, which is also a point of contact with Bob. Sorry, it's a little bit difficult for me to. But besides all his intellectual greatness, which was a lot, he was also a fantastic entrepreneur. He was someone who started with online education in Latin America and Argentina, particularly in the 90s, when really nothing was developed. He saw that was the future, and he started with that. And that is why I think he created so many disciples and so many Austrians, not only in Argentina, but all across Latin America. He had leading positions at UFN, that we have, people representing that magnificent university in Guatemala, in ESEADE, which is a great institution that promotes Austrian economics in Argentina, at the Catholic University, and in many other places. The people who knew him that are here, they can testify that his intellectual greatness was really great, was amazing. But the people who, like me, who had the privilege and Adrian and many others who had the privilege to call him a friend, we can also testify that he was an exceptional human being. He was one of the most generous persons I've ever met. He was extremely funny. He was a Boca Juniors supporter, which is a team in Argentina. That was very bad. That was, he had to have a spot, if not, he would be a saint. And this is why, and he was, of course, a great supporter of this conference. And we did some things in Vienna with Barbara and Juan Carlos, and he would be here. Unfortunately, and in a very premature way, he passed away, the last day of 2015, being only 62 and probably at his prime intellectually. Some of his work is already available in English, and I'm sure most of it will be in the future. Take a look at journallibertas.com of his thesis that, with that he paid a debt to Mises. Very few people can say that. And this is why we are starting this series. And last, but definitely not least, I think it's a perfect match, and it's a great, and I'm extremely thankful to Bob for him being the one who will start this first, Cachanosky Memorial Lecture. I was very clear to Bob when I asked him to do this. I told him, Juan Carlos was one of the greatest. You are one of the greatest. This is a perfect match. Both wrote about the 1929 crisis, but most of all, and with this I'll finish. Like Juan Carlos, Bob is an extraordinary person. He's extremely generous, extremely humble. This is not the first time that Bob joins us for these kind of things, to promote Austrian economics. In 2016, he came to Rosario, to Argentina, to our conference. By the way, he said it was the best conference he ever attended. So, we gave him a good time. 2017, we were touring with Richard, among others. We were touring Central Europe, with the Free Market Roadshow. And today he's here with us. So, I'm not going to introduce very much Bob Murphy because I'm sure all of you know him. But I want to know, and many of you also know this, but he's extremely generous, and I'm really thankful for you to do this. Finally, his latest book, as you know, is called Contra Krugman, Smashing the Errors of America's and probably the world's most famous Keynesian. But thank God he's not going to be talking about the Keynesian today. He's going to be talking about an economist. And let's hear what Bob has to say about the continuing relevance of Mises economics. Thank you very much, and thank you, Bob.
Well, thank you for those kind remarks, Federico. Let me tell you guys a quick story about Federico. So the way I always think of him now is we were, as he mentioned, part of the Free Market Roadshow a couple years ago. And so we were going through, I happened to be on the leg going through Eastern Europe. And so one of the countries where we stopped, and we were going to give a presentation the next day, and the theme of the hotel was like nostalgia for communism. And so, it was a former Soviet bloc country, and I forget which country it was, but so the style or the theme was each of the rooms was dedicated to someone who was like of the history of communism. And so like my room, when I went in there was like a portrait of some general who had been in the Red Army or something. And so we checked in, and then Federico goes up to, and he comes back and he says to the people behind the desk, I need a different room. And they said, why? And he said, because there's a portrait of Fidel Castro. He's a mass murderer. And the people were laughing and we know he's serious. He really has a thing about staying in rooms with mass murderers. And so they which is not that odd of a request when you think about it. But so they did switch him. And so I think he slept in a room that also had a portrait of a mass murderer, but it was a lower body count. And so that was, he did what he could. Okay, so as he said, I'm going to be speaking to you. I want to leave time at the end for some of your questions, so I'm going to go through this material pretty quickly. So let me just say, for example, if somebody says, hey, what were Murray Rothbard's contributions to economic science? That's actually, I would have to pause and think for a minute. And there are several, don't get me wrong, but largely what Rothbard does in Man, Economy, and State, and actually that's that's how the book began, is Rothbard set out to write a more accessible to an English-speaking audience version of human action, and that became the book that we now refer to as Man, Economy, and State. And so again, don't misunderstand me. There are some genuine innovations that Rothbard does in there, but largely when it comes to pure economic theory, Rothbard was largely just taking, what Böhm-Bawerk and Menger and Mises had done and just sort of, making it very accessible and elaborating upon it. Whereas if you ask me what were Ludwig von Mises' contributions to economic theory, I would say, well, how much time do you have, right? I would need to know, how do I need to pace myself here? So with you guys right now, I have about a half an hour, including the time I want to leave for your questions. So I'll go through this fairly quickly. And I focused on just, as you'll see, some of them. And so here's the outline of what I'm going to be talking about. So his framework for how do you classify money in a theoretical sense. How did Mises incorporate money in subjective value theory? What he referred to as the circulation credit theory of the trade cycle. Nowadays, it's typical, at least in among English speakers, to refer to that as the Austrian theory of the business cycle. But that phrase right there is technically the way Mises referred to it when he developed it. And then finally, his famous critique of socialism, namely that in a socialist commonwealth there can be no genuine economic calculation. And then what I'm going to do, and sorry, some of this is overlapping a bit, is show you, so there I'm showing you his contributions, but then I want to say these continue to be relevant. And so the things I'll cover in this talk right now are going to be, many of you probably know that when the yield curve inverts, it predicts a recession, and that's at least been a pattern since World War II. And Misesian business cycle theory, I think, explains that beautifully and much better than when the mainstream economics profession tries to explain that correlation. Also, business cycle dynamics, I'll show you a chart where certain facts of the business cycle match what the Austrian prediction would be, whereas they don't really fit well with a Keynesian explanation. And then finally, when commenting on why are certain government programs inefficient, I think the Misesian paradigm gives some insights that even like a public choice framework doesn't. And so let me just mention, sometimes, certainly in the United States, because there the Chicago school is very prominent, and so among free market fans or people who are interested in libertarian politics, for a lot of them, they don't understand. They'll ask me, why do you care so much about the Austrian school? Like, isn't it just free market? Like Milton Friedman's good, right? And there are differences though, and it's not merely one of politics or of policy conclusions. That yes, it is true. The Chicago school has different policy recommendations for what a central bank ought to be doing compared to the Austrians, for example, because the Austrians typically would say there shouldn't be a monopoly in that area. But nonetheless, even besides that, I'm saying in terms of pure economic theory, there's a difference. And just to give you one quick example, as I was just preparing for this talk, I was going and reading some past things I had written just to jog my memory. If you studied Mises, you would know, for example, he stressed the fact that prices are money's not a measuring rod, right? The Mises over and over in his more theoretical works. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is from his 1912. In English, they translate the title as The Theory of Money and Credit. Guido Hülsmann says that actually a more direct translation from the German would be The Theory of Money and Fiduciary Media. But in any event, that 1912 work is where Mises developed a lot of this stuff. And so there again, like I say, although it's understandable how modern people associate with the Chicago school or what's called monetarism in the United States, they don't like rampant price inflation. And so they realize that business people can't make calculations if prices are very volatile because of central bank policy. And so unfortunately, though, sometimes they go so far as to say money should have a constant fixed value to be like a measuring rod, to be like a ruler, right? When we're measuring length in meters or in feet, depending on where you are, that's a constant thing. You wouldn't want the ruler to be changing, and so they're saying that's what it's like when there's inflation. And Mises actually addressed that and said, no, there's a fallacy there. You're wrong if you think there can be a fixed unit of measurement. All right. So in this talk here, I won't get into that, but I'm just saying that was something fairly recent where, if you might know Steve Forbes, is an American business person, and he's big in free market circles, and he had come out with a book talking about stabilizing the value of the dollar, and he was using this metaphor, saying we need to have a fixed measuring rod. And then David Gordon of the Mises Institute criticized him and said, no, that's actually not good economics, and was trying to explain why. And then other people who were like students of monetarism, like PhD economists, were jumping in saying, what's the problem with this David Gordon guy? This is pretty basic economics. And it was just amazing to me reading the exchanges to realize how much I had benefited from studying Mises, that someone who had read Mises would realize the sort of abstract but important points that David Gordon had been raising, and these other people who were like studying money, like their school of thought was monetarism, but yet this was a pretty elemental fact that they just missed at step one. Okay, so again, for those who are familiar with the work of Mises on this, some of this stuff you might take for granted, but other schools of thought, like just real elementary things, they miss. Okay, so let me go through some of these contributions. So I would encourage you, it's very interesting to read Mises' 1912 work. Again, the English title is The Theory of Money and Credit, because you'll see early on he explains some of the choices he had to make. And also, he didn't merely echo the choices that Menger had made, or Böhm-Bawerk. Okay, so there's Karl Menger, and then Böhm-Bawerk was his direct inheritor, like the second generation, if you will, and then Mises, in a sense, came as a third generation, if you want to think of it like that. And so what I'm saying is the decisions Mises had to make in terms of economic theory, and he'll explain in the book why he's doing it. So I would encourage you to look at it, not so much because of the particular details of each case, even though they're interesting, but just so you can see that when there is a genius who is developing new theories, like he has to kind of survey the field and then make decisions about, well, should I do it this way or that way? And so just to give you one example of the kind of thing I mean, like how do you classify money itself, right? So they had these general categories of economic value, and they had distinguished between production goods and consumption goods. And then the question was, okay, what is money? So money's an economic good, and then but what kind is it? And so Mises was saying, well, clearly, yes, if there's only those two classifications, then money per se is not a consumption good, so it's got to be a production good. But then he was saying why there were all the problems with if you made that decision. And so then he sided with another theorist, not Böhm-Bawerk. So Böhm-Bawerk had said production there, just because it clearly can't be consumption. And Mises actually said, no, there's a third possibility. Instead of having this two-part distinction, let's have a third category called exchange good. And that's what money clearly is. Okay, so again, I'm saying things like that where nowadays we take it for granted. Like if you study in the Austrian tradition, you'll say, oh, money's a medium of exchange that is universally accepted or is widely accepted in the community. But I'm saying just that terminology, and to call it a medium of exchange and to think of it that way, at some point in the past, those decisions were created, or those classifications were created. And you can see Mises explaining his thought process in his 1912 work. So it's pretty interesting. So again, the way Mises defines what money is, and when it comes to things like cryptocurrencies and people saying, hey, is Bitcoin money? For me, it's very helpful that Mises had this framework in place to say, like, what is the definition of money? And so it's not, something that stores its value and is easily divisible and things like that. If you read some modern textbooks and they define money, those are more attributes of a desirable money. That's not the definition of what makes something money. And so in the Misesian framework, it's the fact that, it's a medium of exchange, meaning it's something that you accept in trade, not because you're going to consume it, and not also because you're going to use it in production, but because you're going to trade it away again. And so that's what a medium of exchange is. But that right there doesn't make it money. So money is a medium of exchange that happens to be accepted nearly universally in a certain community of people, and then that good is money for those people. Okay, and so that's, again, just the framework and the way he was defining it. And something as simple as having a crisp definition of money is still useful today when it comes to things like new types of money, or things that might be money, purported to be money, like cryptocurrency. Okay, now within that framework, then you've got that definition, and then Mises made another decision, and this has to do with his theory of the business cycle. Is he said, okay, we've got this idea of money now, and then he said, I think it's important that Mises in this book that I'm writing here, am going to make a different distinction of money in the broader sense and money in the narrower sense. So I think you guys can probably see that. I'm going to explain each one in case you can't fully read this, don't worry. But so this is a diagram that actually the translator of one of the versions of the Theory of Money and Credit for an English audience put in the appendix, and I thought this was very helpful to see the whole framework. Okay, so money in the broader sense for Mises includes money in the narrower sense, and then what he also called money substitutes. Okay, so it makes sense. Money in the broader sense is a bigger category. So it's money in the narrower sense and then money substitutes. And also I'll go through these. So money in the narrower sense consists of these three things down here. So the first is commodity money, and that's pretty, gold, silver, tobacco, cows, right? Things that started out as regular commodities in the marketplace, and then for various historical reasons ultimately became adopted as money. Also, there's something called credit money. For us nowadays, this is sort of an odd, it's hard to make sense of this. What Mises means by this is he's saying it's money, it's something that used to be money, and people have the expectation that it will be money again in the future, but right now it's not. And so here, historically, he has in mind, during wartime, if the government suspended specie redemption for notes. Okay, so if the U.S. dollar was the same thing, was a ticket that got you a certain amount of gold or silver, but then because there's a war, the banks and the government stopped that redemption policy, people still would use the dollar notes in exchange, but it was because Mises thought, it's not because what we would call fiat money, he was saying no, it's because they thought, okay, once the war ends, they're going to restore the redemption, and so that was the reason people were trading. It was in anticipation of that future time when the redemption would be restored. So Mises decided to call that credit money. So the reason it's still money is, if you apply the definition, even when the redemption had been suspended, that was still, it was clearly a medium of exchange, and it was universally accepted, among Americans, if we're talking about dollar notes, for example. So, that's money in the narrower sense that fits the definition, but he was calling it credit money because, again, to try to, as an economist, to explain why are people trading around these notes. And he said even though they're technically not a claim ticket, he was saying, well, it's because they think in the future it will be, restored. Okay, and then the last thing was fiat money. Now, what's interesting for us, we all know what this is because we use it almost as a swear word at this point. But for Mises, what's interesting, if you go read it, so again, this came out in 1912, and Mises' discussion here, he's filling out the logical framework, the possibilities given his framework, and he says something like, we must admit the theoretical possibility of fiat money. Okay, so he's saying at that point, Mises doesn't think fiat money has ever truly existed because, again, to him, historical episodes where redemption had been suspended, some of you might have been tempted to say, oh, that turned it into fiat money for 10 years during, the wartime suspension. And for Mises, no, he would say, no, that's credit money because there was the expectation that the redemption would be restored. But if the redemption is eliminated and people continue to circulate these notes now, which don't entitle you to anything, they're not a claim ticket anymore, it's just the paper note is the money, the base money, period, end of story. If that happens and the community kept using them, then Mises is saying that's what I would call fiat money. And again, it's interesting because he's saying that we must admit the theoretical possibility. So I like that because number one, it shows Mises was a good economist, that he anticipated, his system, he didn't just classify the things that he had seen and observed historically. His system was robust enough and he was, creative enough to realize, oh, there's this logical possibility. But also it's sort of charming because when you hear him discuss it, he's almost, saying it's, oh, heaven forbid, but we must admit it's possible there might be one day where, people are using this fiat money that's not backed by a regular commodity. Okay, so now as far as money substitutes, again, so the way this diagram's working, the money substitutes consist of these two things. So one's money certificates, that's just a genuine 100% backed claim ticket, right? So if a commercial bank, if you deposit some gold at a commercial bank, if gold is the money, is the commodity money, and you deposit gold at a commercial bank and they give you some notes or they give you a checkbook allowing you to write checks on it, and the outstanding claims that the bank issues are backed up 100% by gold in the vault, then that's just a money certificate, right? So that has no real economic impact in terms of the business cycle. Where the big problem would be is in the issue of what's called fiduciary media. So these are money substitutes that are not backed by the underlying money in the narrower sense. And then of that token money, so certain governments might issue coins that don't actually have silver content, and so technically, in terms of the legal, back when, the money was redeemable in gold and silver, the notes that the government issued, so the token coins could be redeemed technically. but the government might issue more tokens than they actually have in reserve to back them up. So Mises is saying technically that's fiduciary media. And then, of course, the big important thing was uncovered bank deposits and notes. All right, so in the Misesian framework, of course, that's what does all the work about generating the boom-bust cycle. So just to step back a minute and say, so this is a nice framework, but Mises explains, in the pages when he's developing this terminology, why he made these decisions. And I just want to make one observation to show you why it's not clear which way it goes. So if you remember what Mises' definition of money was, he said it's a medium of exchange that's universally accepted among a certain community. So with that definition, arguably unbacked bank deposit notes, right? So a checking account that has fractional reserve banking, arguably a note that bank issued could be considered just as money, end of story. Because it's a medium of exchange. Clearly, it's not a consumption good. It's not a production good. It's an exchange good. And as long as the community we're talking about, if those banknotes trade or exchange at par with the commodity money, if people in practice don't make a distinction and have apply a discount when they accept notes from a bank because it's reputable, then that's the same thing as money in a certain sense, right? If it's interchangeable. And so Mises was saying, it would be acceptable if an economist wanted to just call that money and have it be in the same classification as like the gold. That's not, there'd be nothing demonstrably wrong about that. He's just saying, because I think this stuff that Mises am calling fiduciary media has to do with generating the business cycle, whereas if there were money certificates, there wouldn't be a business cycle. He's saying that's why I think it's important for us to make a distinction there. So that's why he came up with that money in the narrower sense and money in the broader sense. Okay, so again, I just want to be clear that the reason for that terminology is because in a sense, they're both money, right? Again, a banknote, even if it's uncovered, so it's fiduciary media, it's a medium of exchange that's accepted nearly universally in the community. So isn't that the definition of money? And so he said, yeah, it is kind of money, but let's call it money in the broader sense. And when I want to reserve money in the narrower sense for the commodity money. Okay, so I'm just saying besides the framework here, if you go read that, it's interesting just if you're going to do some theoretical work and want to develop things just to see the way he has to apply the decisions he had to make. So he always says, ultimately, what are we trying to do as economists? What phenomena in the market are we trying to explain? And that should guide our theoretical decisions, or what I should say is our decisions about how to develop certain theoretical concepts. Okay, so for this stuff, it wasn't that he was saying there's an ultimate fact of the matter, like is that money in the narrow or broader sense? He was just saying it's very useful to use this classification framework because Ludwig von Mises, think this explains the business cycle, so let's do it this way. Whereas if you just called everything money, including unbacked banknotes, you would be at a loss to explain how come there was a boom bust here, but not over here, because they would both just be using money, right? Okay, so one of the main things he did in this book was he incorporated money into Mengerian subjective value theory. So that might sound surprising at first, right? Because Menger's book comes out in 1871. This is like the birth of Austrian economics in this book right here. And yet Mises' theory of money and credit doesn't come out until 1912. So it seems odd that there was that huge gap between taking the subjective value theory that Menger and Jevons and Walras are credited with creating, and why did it take so many decades to apply it to money? And it wasn't because there was a reluctance to use this theory, right? So this swept the field. Mengerian subjective value theory swept the economics profession. So economists had been using what we now call subjective value theory for quite some time, but they'd been using it on a barter economy, right? So they would have simplistic models where there was no money and people were just directly trading goods against each other. And they would use the principles of marginal utility, what we call nowadays marginal utility theory, to explain the equilibrium exchange ratios if it were a barter economy. But then if they wanted to say, but in the real world, everything first trades against money and there's money prices, then they had a whole separate theoretical framework that they laid on top of that. Like, with the MV equals PQ, that sort of framework, right? A very holistic aggregate macro framework, whereas this is micro subjective framework to explain equilibrium exchange ratios. So the question is, why did it take Mises to do that? And so let me very quickly explain it. Because there was a problem. So originally, economists, when they took this new Mengerian subjective value theory, and thought, so we can explain why an apple trades for 2 oranges in equilibrium, right? It has to do with marginal utility and things like, that kind of stuff. They were happy with that. They thought it was great. But when it came to explaining, okay, why does, the French franc have a certain objective purchasing power and the German mark has a different purchasing power, they thought there was a problem just trying to use marginal subjective value theory to explain that. And the reason is because they thought it would be arguing in a circle, right? So specifically, this is the way they were trying to think it through. They were saying, okay, why do you value money, right? It's like, so why do I value this? Oh, because subjectively it quenches my thirst, and that has a certain ranking on my value scale. It's important to me on the margin, that sort of thing. So I can explain the market exchange value of a bottle of water ultimately by reference to my desire to avoid dying of thirst, things like that, right? So that subjective value theory worked very well for final consumption goods. With money, though, it seemed tricky because if you say, why do I value a 10-euro note? And the first answer is, well, because I know it has objective purchasing power. I know I can go buy things with it, and I have subjective value that I attribute to those things. So that's why I, walk it back and value the 10-euro note. And then you say, okay, so you subjectively value this because it has objective purchasing power. But then if you say, why does it have objective purchasing power? If you're going to use subjective value theory, you say, oh, the reason this has objective purchasing power is because we subjectively value it. Just like the reason I like this is because I subjectively value quenching thirst. Okay, so if you think that through, it looks like what you're saying is the reason people value money is because people value money. So that's not a false statement, but you see how that doesn't seem like it's explaining very much? Right? Again, or you might say, oh, the reason money has objective purchasing power is because money has objective purchasing power. So that, that's a true statement, but it doesn't seem like it gives you very much, right? So that was the problem. That's why they thought, yeah, subjective value theory is circular in the case of money, but Mises showed that no, it's not. And so, and the way he broke out of that circularity argument was by introducing the time element. Okay, so I'm gonna speed up here my remarks. So I want to get to some of this later material, but the idea being what Mises said is it's not. Don't just say money has purchasing power because money has purchasing power. Yeah, that's a circular argument. That seems silly. He said more specifically or more accurately what it is. Money today has purchasing power. So what does it mean to have purchasing power? It means people give goods and services in exchange for money today. So why are they doing that? The people right now who are like selling their labor hours in exchange for euros, why are they doing that? It's because they anticipate that tomorrow that euro is going to have purchasing power, right? So notice the time element. So the reason today they're selling their labor for euros is because they expect in the near future that euro will have purchasing power. And then if you ask, well, how do they know that? Where do they come up with these expectations? Mises would say, oh, it's because they just observed in the recent past, I'll just say yesterday, that the euro had purchasing power, right? So because they saw the prices in the market recently, that makes them have expectations about the near future, and that's why right now they would sell a car, or they would sell labor hours, or sell a house in exchange for euros. Okay, so he's broken up. So this isn't from him. This is me just trying to summarize it in a pithy way to say money has purchasing power today because you expect it to have purchasing power tomorrow. And why? Because you saw that it had purchasing power yesterday. Okay, so you see that's not a circular argument. We've broken it up. Now, some critics had thought of that, and they said, okay, well, now we don't have a circularity problem, we just have an infinite regress, because you're ultimately saying today's purchasing power of money is ultimately derived from yesterday's purchasing power of money. Well, okay, well, how did it get purchasing power yesterday, Mises? Oh, from the day before yesterday, and you just go on forever, and they throw up their hands and say that's not a good answer. And so then Mises says, no, we can trace it back until the point at which the money good was just a regular commodity, back in the days of barter, or we would say direct exchange to be more technical. Okay, and Karl Menger had already given us a theoretical explanation for how you could start with a state of pure barter and money could emerge gradually step by step. Okay, so Mises was saying this isn't an infinite regress, there's a finite stopping point. Okay, so to be clear, Mises wasn't doing a historical investigation. It wasn't like he said, for the German mark, here's where in history it started. He wasn't doing that. He was just saying theoretically, logically speaking, this is not a philosophical problem here. There is a logical stopping point to my argument. Okay, so that's the way he showed that you use Mengerian subjective value theory to apply it to everything. And so that might not seem like a big deal, but that, to me, I would say that unified what had been micro and macroeconomics. And he showed, no, it's just one value theory that explains the relative exchange value of everything, even the money commodity trading against other goods and services. It's the same theoretical framework we're using, right? Because originally it's sort of odd that you use one framework to explain as if everything's done in barter, and then as an afterthought you say, oh, but in practice there's money, and we use a totally different framework that doesn't obey methodological individualism or subjectivism. It almost seems like physics or something, where we have, an equation of exchange and there's velocity of circulation, right? Like, that doesn't even sound like economics or Austrian economics, and that's the way we're going to explain money, right? It'd be one thing if that's the way you're going to explain tuna fish and the price of tuna, but to explain the value of money, that seems pretty important, that we're doing something that in any other area violates all of our precepts of good economic theory to explain the value of money. So that's what Mises did here. Okay, he also developed his circulation credit theory of the trade cycle. I'm going to go quickly through this because I think most of you know this. I want to get to the applications. So circulation credit is when banks issue new loans of fiduciary media, meaning media not backed up by commodity money in the vault. By doing so, it drives the interest rate below the natural rate. So here, again, just to show what Mises did, he has antecedents, right? People, he's relying on their work, and he's just taking bits and pieces and incorporating it into this new theory, right? So it's fascinating to see how he does it. Just like in any science, people don't start from scratch; they build on the work of their predecessors. So with him, he's taking Mengerian subjective value theory. He's taking this concept of natural interest rate from Wicksell, and then Menger and Bombaverk's theory of like a structure of production, and there's stages of production, and showing how if the interest rate is wrong, if it's below the so-called natural rate, then it distorts that structure of production. So that leads to an unsustainable boom, which then necessarily leads to a bust. So there's monetary and what we would call real elements in this theory, and I think it's superior to mainstream theories that usually focus on one or the other, right? So there's real business cycle theory, which doesn't care much about money, and then there's Keynesian theories, which focus more on demand. And so the Austrian theory is sort of this interesting hybrid, if you will, that it has monetary factors that then cause real consequences that necessitate a bust. Okay, and then of course, there's the impossibility of economic calculation. Let me just mention, the claim here is immediate. So sometimes I see people motivate a discussion of this, and they'll say, oh, Mises said that a socialist country couldn't last. And in the beginning, critics disagreed with him, but then with the fall of the Soviet Union, people realized Mises was right. And I mean, I'm glad that the critics, realized Mises was right, but I'm concerned that when you tell the story that way, it makes it sound like what Mises was doing was making an empirical prediction about the longevity of a regime. And that's not what he was doing. He was saying from day one, if you have genuine government ownership of all the means of production, then there's no market prices for capital goods, and that means nobody can perform calculation. They don't know what's the value of the resources they're using in a production plan, so there's no way to look at the output and compare it to the inputs and say, is the output more valuable than what we used to create it? Like, in principle, it's not even the ex post we can look back and see through trial and error, did we get it right? Right, so that's what the claim was, and that's not something that takes 70 years to manifest itself. That's from day one. Okay, so I just want to clarify that his claim was a theoretical one, immediate. Also, just to clarify, I think this is a different thing from the Hayekian knowledge problem, or dispersed knowledge. So the Hayek's work there is very important, but I would caution you not to just lump it together and say, oh yeah, Mises and Hayek showed the problem of socialism. They were distinct critiques, right? Because Mises assumes from the outset that the central planner has all the relevant engineering knowledge and technical know-how, production functions and whatnot, and it's more a matter of just knowing the value of the inputs compared to the outputs. Okay, and then also, along with this critique then, Mises shows how in a market economy do we get around that, and that's because, there's private property and there's money. And that's necessary because you need to have, again, market prices for the means of production. So each entrepreneur can ask his or her accountant at the end of a year, were we profitable? And that's the way to determine the value of what we produced for our customers. How does that compare to the value of the inputs we used? And again, without money, you couldn't do that. And without ownership in the means of production, you couldn't do that, right? So just showing how a market economy solves this problem. Okay, so let me now very quickly just run through some of the current applications of these contributions. So the fact that the yield curve inverts before a recession. So on this chart, the gray lines are recessions, and what that blue line is, it's the 10-year Treasury minus the 2-year Treasury. So when that goes below that black line, that means it's an inverted yield curve, that the 2-year interest rate is higher than the 10-year. And so notice it goes negative before each of those gray lines. So this chart goes back to the late 1970s. That pattern holds up, depending on how you define it, at least back to World War II. And so why does that happen? In the Misesian framework, I would say it's quite obvious that it just happens because if you think about what causes the unsustainable boom, it's when banks are expanding credit and pushing interest rates artificially low. So what can banks control if you're talking about the interest rate? Okay, but when you get more realistic and say there's multiple interest rates, there's a whole yield curve, banks can influence shorter term rates more than longer term rates. So just think through the standard Austrian story. During a boom with easy money, it's short rates that would get pushed low. Long rates would stay higher, so you'd have an upward sloping yield curve. Then when the banks get nervous and tighten and raise rates, it's primarily short rates that would go up. And that, if it goes up enough, it would invert the yield curve. And so that makes sense that a recession would happen after they do that. Also, why don't I just end with this slide, because I want to give you guys time here for questions. So I'll just explain this one. So this is business cycle dynamics. So what I've done here is shown, so that's April 2008 up to July 2012, or sorry, 2010, and it's an index. So it starts at 100, and it's employment in 4 different sectors. So that red line is retail trade, the purple line is non-durable goods, then durable goods is the green, and then the low blue one is employees in construction. And so what you can see is after the crisis hit, the Great Recession, the financial crisis in 2008, this is U.S. data, you see that the drop in employment as a percentage of the value, at the peak, is greatest for construction. The next biggest drop is for durable goods. Then the next biggest is non-durable, and the lowest reduction in employment was on retail. So you see, if you know Austrian theory, that makes perfect sense that the industries that got hit the most were, construction, which is very, in a Hayekian triangle, it's farther away from retail or consumption. And then durable goods are more long-lived than non-durable, and retail is like the final stage, giving it to the consumer. So that lines up perfectly with the Misesian theory, whereas a Keynesian story that just, the Great Recession was because there was a housing bust, people got scared, they stopped spending money, and then that lack of demand percolated around the economy. You wouldn't expect this. If you might expect just a general proportional drop, or maybe you would think even retail would drop the most, and then because consumers aren't spending, and then that would percolate back, but you wouldn't expect that, right? So the standard story of this is just an aggregate demand, I think doesn't fit this at all, whereas this fits in very nicely with the Misesian theory. Okay, why don't I stop right there? Thank you for your attention, and I have some time for questions.
Thank you. My name is Eki Weiss. I just have some soothing comfort in these dismal times when everyone has been waiting for this fucking recession to come, given the inverted yield curve, and it just has not come yet. And that does not mean it will never come. But the good news was today, before I left to come here for the conference, Bloomberg television informed about yields on the German 10-year Treasury. They are about to re-invert. Yesterday the yield was 0.8% negative, and this morning it has advanced to 0.3 negative %. Congratulations. Thank you.
Santner, retired. Mr. Murphy, I was very much impressed by your lecture, and I'm also an admirer of Mises. Every time when I read something of him, I always learn a lot. But there are 2 points where I'm not entirely satisfied with him. The first is, which you didn't mention, his idea of a priori, the a priori idea, which naturally he took from Kant. Kant said a priori in his famous critique of the pure reason. I think there's, and Kant is already criticized because of that. And I think there's nothing like a priori. There's only a posteriori. That means all is based on experience, but it has to be ordered in a logical manner. So no a priori, all a posteriori, and a logical thinking. These are the 2 points regarding to the idea of a priori. This is my first point. The second is the concept of money. Naturally, there is no doubt today that money is an exchange good. But this idea is not complete, but it is extremely incomplete even. There are 2 aspects which are at least as important, I think, as this exchange good idea. The first is money is also a right. When you have worked and you get money for that, you have in principle the right to get an equivalent commodity. So this right character is most of the time neglected. And even more neglected, because it is totally inconvenient for our central banks, is the idea of measure. It is a measure. When there was the first dollar law in the United States, dollar was defined against gold, and it was said at the time, dollar is as good as gold. Mm-hmm. If you would say this today, all people would consider you a madman. There is no dollar or euro the same. Naturally, there is no difference. There is no no dollar as good as gold, no euro as good as gold. Think, for reason of comparison, the famous meter measure in Paris. This, fortunately, is handled by scientists. So for the last 100 or I don't know how many years, the meter is a meter. Only imagine that this meter measure would be handled by central banks. It would be today 10 centimeters, and they would tell you these 10 centimeters are a meter. So this happens exactly with the money. The measure moment of the money is totally neglected. Nobody ever is speaking that money is also a measure totally comparable to the meter measure in Paris. This is not naturally acceptable to central bank, but for a complete idea of money, you have to have the 3 aspects. It is an exchange good, it is a right, and it is a measure.
Okay, I have time to answer? Okay, so real quickly, you mentioned at one point that if I had said the dollar is as good as gold, people would say I'm a madman. They already say I'm a madman, so I might as well just go ahead and say that. But so the substantive points on the a priori stuff, and I'm going to be real brief here, obviously. I'm not going to get a satisfactory defense. But to be clear, so, Mises helped Hayek become the director of a center that studied business panics, right? So they were using empirical measurements there, obviously, like looking at, when did the certain industries turn, what was the turning point, what happened with the prices of various commodities and things, and historical boom busts. So it wasn't that Mises was against empiricism. He was just saying the logical framework of economic theory, in his opinion, you were developing it through logical deduction. And so really quickly, let me just mention things like, once we decide we're going to interpret things as the result of human action, right? So if I throw a rock up in the air and it goes like this, physicists aren't going to say, well, originally the rock wanted to go towards the sun, then it got too hot and changed its mind and turned around. It's not merely that would be wrong, it's that people would say, that's not physics. What are you talking about? That's not the way we do it. But it makes sense if someone's driving a bus and then goes like this and then goes like that, it's perfectly sensible as social scientists to say, oh, the driver wanted to go over there and then realized, he forgot his wallet and turned around, right? That's not you wouldn't say, oh, that's not a very scientific statement as a social, you know what I mean? Like, no, the fact that you have intentions, that's the essence of social science. And so once you make that decision, then you can say things like every action or every choice has an opportunity cost. That's not a testable proposition. That flows from our decision to treat it not as matter obeying the laws of physics, but as a subjective being making a conscious choice to achieve some goal, right? Then necessarily, if you choose one thing, the next best thing that you can attain, that's the opportunity cost, right? So you can't go test that. That's a natural. So that's where he was coming from, that economic categories follow from our decision to decide to classify things that way. And then real briefly, the money is measuring rod. I agree, many economists don't talk about that, but again, as I mentioned in the beginning, this was a controversy. Steve Forbes, he's not a professional economist, but he was proposing something and said, yes, it should be like a meter. Well, he might have said like a foot, because he's American. But so he was saying it should be like a ruler, and David Gordon was pointing, the Mises would just disagree with that. So real quickly, it's not an issue of saying, yeah, the dollar can be tied to gold. That's fine. And you could say the dollar is the same thing as 35 ounces of gold. But then the question is gold a measure of some other thing called value? The way a meter stick measures length. So a meter is just a standard unit measuring this other concept called length. So if you're saying what gold really does is measure something called economic value, that's what Mises disagreed with. He's saying value is subjective. You can't have an objective unit measuring something that's ultimately subjective.
We have 3 minutes and many hands, so please be very quick with your questions, very precise, and to also you be very short.
Okay, yeah.
Well, congratulations, Bob, for your presentation. The big problems of applied economics is timing.
Mm-hmm.
What you show here is that we have the U.S. recession coming, that it is here. My question is that the Fed is taking interest rates down, and how long do you think they can be successful in, how long this is going to last?
Okay, so yeah, the way often if I speak to a general crowd and they say, hey, when's the crash coming? And I always say, in the future, right? So let me just say here, to be frank, I've been surprised at how long they kept, what I call the boom since 2008, 2009, with all the central banks doing what, in the U.S. is called quantitative easing. I'm surprised it's lasted this long without another crash. So clearly, bond investors aren't looking at the world the way I am. So either I'm wrong or they're wrong in terms of that. But I would say just objectively, so this isn't even Austrian economics anymore, but just that chart that I showed of the yield curve, and I know the earlier gentleman was alluding to this also. I mean, that, depending on whether you use the 3-month and 10-year or the 2-year and 10-year, it depends. But clearly, the yield curve in U.S. financial markets inverted either last March or last August, depending on which measure you use. And so if there's not a recession within the next year, and I mean later when they look back and say, when did the recession start? So it might not be obvious that they're in a recession, but you know how later they can look back and say it started. If it doesn't start within the next 12 months or so, that will be the first time, at least since World War II, that has happened. Okay, so it's not merely that I say, oh, I don't like central banks and they ruin everything. They do, but it's not an ideological statement. I'm saying that's a pretty standard thing where so people who say maybe that signal is going to be wrong this time, they're going to say, because right now the markets are, as you were saying, the markets are so weird with negative, that maybe the historical lessons don't apply right now because the rules are so different with what central banks have been doing. So, that may be, just because it happened before doesn't mean it's going to happen now, but I am saying I personally would be surprised if it doesn't happen within the next year, just because if it doesn't, then that whole pattern of the yield curve, for example, would no longer hold up, and that's not a merely Austrian idiosyncratic position. Is that, are we out?
One more question very quickly.
Oh, one more question, something real easy. Should we get this guy back here? Oh.
It's not easy. Still?
Okay.
Thanks. Rahim Tagisadian from Vienna. Great lecture. Forgive me, I just need to challenge you on a little thing, so probably.
Okay. We're out of time. Sorry. Thank you, everybody.
I think it's not your fault. I think there's another translation error other than the one you pointed out in the title in Mises' theory of money and fiduciary media. I think what in the English is fiat money is in the original Zeichengeld, and it's more symbolic money by convention. And thus I take issue with your interpretation of the classification. I think any certificate that's not redeemed, even if it's temporarily, it should be a transformation of money certificate to fiduciary media and not credit money, and only symbolic money in the last and final phase when modern monetary theory gets it right. And there's absolutely no idea of ever redeeming anything. So just a little challenge on the interpretation. Thanks.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, I don't speak German, so I could just... You might be right. How's that? Do you still dislike fiat money? That's the important thing. All right. Okay?
Bob will be here. You can talk to him at the lunch or coffee breaks.
Okay, thanks.